Day 2 of the Skilling Open, and I've picked a game played in the final round of the day between Sergei Karjakin and Magnus Carlsen. At this moment in the tournament, Carlsen was sharing the lead, whereas Karjakin was way down the tournament table. And I just have a feeling that Carlsen wanted to really get something from this game to really keep the pressure on Karjakin to wind him up. And he plays this Philidor opening with black. A little bit of a surprise, no mainline Spanish. I think he's trying to get Karjakin out of his sort of, well, extensive opening theory, basically. He's very well prepared. But well, both players, in fact, are quite familiar with this position. It looks a little bit passive to play like this with black, but Carlsen has had experience of this position with both colours. Karjakin has also faced this with white before, so more on that in a second. Of course, these players know each other very well. They're both born in the year 1990, so of the same generation. And yeah, they've played against each other since they were kids, really. And well, memorably in their 2016 World Championship match, where Carlsen won a rapid play tiebreak. Could he do the same in this game? Now, Karjakin has selected a system against the Philidor, which I think is very sensible. Playing g3 and bishop g2 supports that e-pawn. And this looks very much like a system that is popular against the Piets. So white doesn't attempt some quick kill against black's king, but supports the centre. And well, we're going to see why that's important in a moment. Bishop f8. So Carlsen plays this very familiar little curl up. The bishop comes back, protecting g7, and opens up the e-file, so there's always a bit of pressure there. But that's why the bishop was developed on g2, to make sure that that pawn is securely protected. And with the e-pawn protected, that gives white the freedom to expand on the king side. h3, that's the prelude to this kingside pawn advance. And Karjakin goes for it straight away with g4. Well, I think this is a really good strategy. Let's see. Knight c5. So Carlsen now attacking the e-pawn with 3 pieces. That's easily defended, rook e1. The other thing about the bishop on g2, as well as supporting the e-pawn, it actually discourages black from breaking out with d5. That's a really important way for black to try to get counterplay in this position, but with a bishop on g2 makes it much harder. c6, so that's necessary. Covers d5, covers b5, potentially allows the queen to come into play along this diagonal. So if you're familiar with the Piets opening, you'll probably recognise this is almost exactly the same as a Piets, except that that bishop stands on f8 instead of on g7. So it's a bit more passive. g5, immediately pushing the knight out of the way. Now that's going to make it much more difficult for black to break out with d5, and now pawn to f4. So this is bold play from Karjakin, and I think it's excellent. The pawn on f4 covers the e5 square, supports the g5 pawn, and later on, well, that pawn could advance even further. Pawn to a5, Carlsen trying to get a bit of space on the queen side, and also, well, sometimes black needs to prevent white from playing b4 as well. Bishop e3, time to develop. Queen c7, a4. So you can see that the queen was defending the pawn on c6, so black might have had the chance to play b5, but of course a4 squashes that plan. Now this is really important, that white prevents the b5 break and at the moment is preventing the d5 break. There is one downside to this kingside expansion. You can see that white's king is potentially a little bit exposed. If black does manage to break through, then there's no pawn cover. Whereas if you look at black's king, it's got a very snug blanket of pawns covering the king. And that bishop looks good on f8 as well. And actually, black's pieces are really restricted by these pawns. Those knights are fighting, well, against each other, really. They tread on each other's toes. It's a problem. And this bishop obviously blocked out. Knight a6. So that is going to allow the king's knight to come to c5. And this one will potentially come into b4. Now here, Karjakin played queen d2. Queen f3 has been played before, and I quite like that move, actually. And that queen can just come over to g3 and support the pawn advance. I think the queen stands very well on the king side because it can potentially cover the king and support that pawn advance. So I like queen f3. Queen d2 played by Karjakin. Also very pleasant because it means that that rook can simply come to d1 to maybe put a little bit of pressure on the pawn on d6. So for example, if black thinks about playing g6 and bishop g7, then rook d1, and there's no way that that bishop can move away because d6 will turn into a target. So back we come. Queen d2 just played, knight c5 and rook d1 anyway. Why not? Let's put all the pieces in the middle. I mean, white's position is just a picture of centralization, an absolutely beautiful position. And black is really squashed here. But this is Carlsen's plan. He's looking forward to the moment where white maybe overcommits and then he'll be able to break out. So he first plays bishop d7. Now the knight drops back to e2. It looks a bit funny to retreat, but actually it's fine. That knight is going to come around to g3 to give even more support to the pawn on e4. Now rook d8 from Carlsen, good move. So you can see finally those rooks are connected. I like that a lot. And that gives black the potential to break sometimes with d5. Let's see how that works in practice. Knight g3, supporting the e-pawn. Queen c8. Okay, well, that's the first little stab that Carlsen has had at white's position. So the h-pawn is threatened. And actually, that immediately shows that white has to be a little bit careful here, because if we play h4, then the bishop will find a nice square on g4 and push that rook away, and that's really irritating. But white does not need to push the pawn. King h2 is a really nice move. Just tucking the king away at the side, protecting the h-pawn, that's nice. And you can see that, well, I like this maneuver of the knight to g3. Would have been nice to put the queen there, but why not put the knight there as well? And the king is looking really snug. And, well, if black does nothing here, if black stays behind the first three ranks, then white is going to play f5. That takes away this square from black's pieces. And then bishop f4, more pressure here. Now, if black withstands that, then the h-pawn can start moving down the board. And at some point, one of these pawns is going to push forward and break open the position. It's a beautiful position for white to play. I love playing like this. I've had quite a few games where basically the squeeze comes on the king side and you just don't let them go. It's great fun. I love it. Okay, here we go. King h2 just played. So, like I said, if black stays passive, then that's a real problem. But of course, Carlsen appreciates that. And very quickly, he launched the d-pawn forward. He didn't spend too long over that. I mean, both players had used a fair bit of time to get to this position. I mean, from memory, I think they were down to maybe 6 or 7 minutes each remaining on the clock. I think Carlsen at this point had like a minute time advantage, something like that. So d5, this is always the move that you have to watch out for when you're playing with white, and, well, be wary of, or be aware that that's the move you want to make when you're playing with black. So, for example, if pawn takes pawn, then suddenly things get interesting. Let's say knight takes, bishop takes a4, and you can see actually black's pieces are really well placed here. Now, white is not worse here, but somehow, well, black is breathing again. And whose king is better? I think that's always something to think about. That bishop can come back to c6. Black's king is very secure there. It's pretty random. So after d5, very sensibly, Karjakin, after 2.5 minutes thought, big time investment, he played pawn to e5. So now we have this 4 against 3 pawn majority on the king side. So ultimately, it'll still be the aim of Karjakin to push the pawns down the board. And Carlsen has this nice pawn chain, but how do you advance those pawns forward? Knight b4 from Carlsen. Queen f2. Now, I like that move a lot from Karjakin. Excellent move, taking control of this diagonal, and that's already a bit uncomfortable for Carlsen. If the knight goes back to e6, we've got f5, thank you very much. That's no good for black at all. Or if the knight goes back to a6, then bishop b6. That's nasty. That rook can't move. The knight would have to go back. I mean, white is obviously in control there. So after queen f2, Carlsen simply defended the knight. But it does mean that if that knight moves, then the bishop will be able to swipe off the b pawn. Bishop d4 from Karjakin. Excellent move. Supporting the e pawn. And he's looking to advance the pawn to f5. If that pawn, well, if he's given another move, then f5 already looks fantastic for white, taking away the e6 square, and, well, a breakthrough is coming soon. So what should black do? Well, Carlsen put the bishop on f5. He could have played g6. I mean, it still looks better for white, but he played bishop f5, just blocking that pawn. But that is a really risky move. Knight and bishop attack the c-pawn, so therefore rook e2. And now g6, so he's trying to, build some kind of blockade on f5. But Karjakin took the opportunity to swipe off that bishop. Good move. Now at first I thought, well, maybe pawn takes to give that knight a square on e4, but actually this is too risky. If black does nothing, then h4 and bishop h3, and that pawn is looking really weak. And otherwise, well, let's say knight e4, you can take, and again take on b6. And actually, white is just in control there. So after knight takes, Carlsen recaptured with the queen. It's still a really tricky position. So the knight and queen have a little bit of pressure here. And Karjakin played what looks like a really natural move here, but it was a mistake. He played pawn to h4, and Carlsen seized his opportunity. He played knight e6, attacking that f-pawn. If Karjakin had played here rook f1, with the idea h4 and bishop h3, that's really nasty, because if knight e6, that pawn is now defended, and you can simply play bishop takes pawn. And, well, white has a winning position there. So rook f1 was the key move in this position, threatening h4. And it's very hard for black to find a good move there. But instead, Karjakin played h4. It looks very natural. And he'd calculated this. Knight e6. Now, this is different. If bishop takes pawn, then this gives black tremendous compensation for the exchange. You can see that white's king is starting to open up. This is really dangerous. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier. If it goes wrong, it can explode in white's face. Just compare the two kings. Black's king very safe. So Karjakin had to defend that pawn. Rook f1. Now, tricky position. If knight takes bishop, that's the move you really want to play. But bishop h3 traps the queen. It has nowhere to go. So Carlsen played instead of playing knight takes bishop, he played c5. Now here, if bishop h3, then you can give the queen here and take on d4. Now material is, let me see, at the moment it's even, but bishop g7 is a very nasty move for white to meet. That pawn is under fire. The king is on the same line as that bishop and the rook as well. Black is simply swiping that pawn and it's winning. Should be a win for black. So after c5, instead of playing bishop h3, bishop e3. And the pawn rolled on. Well, this was a turn of events. Carlsen suddenly pushing the pawn. But it's not so clear. Bishop h3 traps the queen. I have to say, this is really well calculated by Sergei Karjakin at this stage. So many ways for white to go wrong here. So for example, if rook takes pawn, then queen takes c2, the queen escapes. If queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn on c2, which attacks the queen. Basically, black is going to escape from that one. So Karjakin, well, he'd planned this very quickly, instantly in fact. He played queen g3. And now that queen is trapped. There's no getting around this one. So Carlsen had to make the best of it. And he gave up his queen by playing queen takes pawn. Rook takes, knight takes. Okay, we need to take stock after that flurry of tactics and the queen has gone. But Carlsen has rook, knight, and rook, knight, and that pawn on e3, that pass pawn on e3. So in fact, this is a really unclear position, particularly if you're down to, just a couple of minutes on the clock. And once again, I come back to the question of king safety. Whose king is safer here? Well, definitely black's at the moment anyway. White's king, well, is now exposed along the second rank. Well, perhaps you'd like to have a think. What would you play here if you had the white pieces? You have a think about that. I'll have a little slurp of tea. Cheers. Karjakin made a mistake here. Quite understandably, he pushed on with pawn to f5. He wants to get through to black's king. But he should have played bishop g4, which just for a moment just gives a little bit more cover here. And then that knight would be free to dance into f6 or potentially d6 as well, depending on where that bishop goes. And white is taking control there. Now, f5 could be on the cards later, but bishop g4 just holds everything for the moment. That's the best move. Instead, he rammed on with f5. This is incredibly dangerous. But here, Carlsen made a mistake in return. He should just move that knight. Now, this is really hard to appreciate when you're short of time. It looks so tempting to slam that rook down on the second rank to hassle white's king. But he should have played knight g7, or knight d4 as well is also possible. Let me just show you a line with knight g7. So pawn takes, pawn takes. Well, if you play f4 and f5, then you should be attacking on the f file. So queen f4, rook e7 defends, bishop g4 covering e2, rook d4, knight e4. Well, you know, all bets are off in this position. You know, if that bishop moves, if it takes the knight, then there's potential for that pawn to advance. This is a completely unclear position. You know, can you imagine playing this with just, you know, a minute or so on the clock? That's what should happen. But rook d2 check was a mistake. The king dropped back to h1. Now what do you play? Carlsen took here. I mean, it's clear that he wants to try and force this one home. The problem is, well, let's play knight g7 now and let's see what happens. Takes here. Bishop g4 covers this, and then white is threatening to play knight e4, attacking the rook, and then getting you on f6. So basically, that rook is now misplaced because white can deal with the threat of e2, and then black is just open to knight e4, or potentially open to an attack on the f file. So that's a serious threat now. And if rook e7, then knight e4. Compared to the other variation, black has had to go backwards. White has gained so much time. This is a completely different situation, and white is actually winning that position. So king h1 has just been played. Carlsen took on f5, bishop takes. And this is a really difficult position. Carlsen went for e2. But let's just have a look at knight d4. Let's see what the problem is. After bishop takes, knight takes. Well, knight e4 is still good, but queen f3 hits that pawn on f7. You can see that that would be fatal. I'm afraid the rooks have been split. That's the problem here. And queen f7 just breaks through to the king. If knight d7, rook d7 rather, knight d5, and wow, you know, that looks pretty bad. Bishop takes, knight takes, and basically white is consolidating here. Still has that extra queen, but black has just gone backwards. Has eliminated that dangerous passed pawn. Carlsen pushed on anyway. Pawn to e2, but that was taken. Bishop takes knight, rook takes, and queen f3. Once again, that rook is loose. It's not protected by its brother. Two threats, queen takes rook, as well as queen f7, which would force checkmate. Of course, the queen is supported by the rook. They're working well together. So, rook e7. Only thing Carlsen could do. That's a sad state of affairs. Had to protect that pawn, but queen takes rook. That errant rook has disappeared from the board. And now what's the material balance? We have queen against knight and bishop. Must be winning for white here. Basically, Carlsen has run out of pieces. Excellent play from Karjakin. He saw the tactics really well. Knight c6. Basically, that queen can just target weaknesses in the position. And Karjakin doesn't need to do anything too special here. Because it's really hard, well, it's impossible for black to activate the pieces when the king really needs protection. Rook f4 is a good move, which basically forces more exchanges. If the rook checks and let's say knight d6, well, I mean, ultimately this is hopeless. Black simply can't attack with the lone rook, and the queen can just clean up the pawns. So after rook f4, rook takes rook, queen takes rook. Well, now with the rook gone, it really is hopeless. There is just one last little trick, which I'll show you in a second. Queen d4. Make sure that something is going to drop here. Knight takes, queen takes, knight c5, and g6. pin and win. And the game ended pretty swiftly. So queen f7 threatened, therefore knight e6. Now Karjakin cleverly didn't take here, but instead first played queen d5. Now Carlsen saved the a-pawn, but queen f5 is an excellent move instead of taking on f7. So basically threat is to take here. Obviously pawn takes pawn allows the knight to be taken, knight d8, and now queen d7 was the final move. Carlsen resigned. Knight is threatened, and if it moves then queen f7 and mate next move. Absolutely hopeless. Let me just go back to this position. There's like I said, there's actually one final trick. It's actually, I find this very interesting. So if black has lots of time and can find some precise moves, then bishop e7 is the best move. And actually black can reach the endgame of bishop and knight against queen. Now this is a theoretical win, and I want to show you how. There is just one big trick though. In this position, white can stumble into a draw with king g2. Now it's a draw. Knight e5. This is a fortress position, a well-known fortress position actually. Can't remember where I first saw it. In one of my I think earliest chess books. The knight, excuse me. Another little slurp tea. The knight covers f7, g6. The bishop covers f8, f6 and h6. So you can see that's a wall basically. The knight is covered. The king covers the bishop. And the king can simply sidestep on these squares. There's actually no Zugzwang, and you can't bring the king into the attack. It's a very nice fortress position. So that's if white plays king g2. However, if white plays queen to e6, it's a really simple move. Very classy move. The threat is to put the king on g6 and win the knight. So at some point, black's king is going to have to move. And now the king advances. And this one is no fortress. Let me just show you. Let's say knight e5, king f5, and this is Zugzwang. The king cannot move. Therefore, one of these pieces is going to have to move. If the bishop comes, well, let's just have a quick look. If bishop g7, then you can give a check. The king steps up and the knight is in the box. And after king f5, if knight f7, we give a check. And king g6. And once again, one of those, well, in fact, both pieces are going to drop very quickly. Bishop is threatened, as well as queen b7 and taking here. So there we go. Just a nice little trick right at the end. Queen e6 is the winning move. Thanks very much for watching. More coming your way soon.